who will be the next president of US matters a lot to our government. So there are many ways that China can actually pressure us.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. In this episode, we are joined by first-time guest Dr. Alice Yang from Taipei, Taiwan in a typhoon game, that is. Alice is an assistant research fellow at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research, Division of Defense Strategy and Resources. In this episode, we'll be examining the future of Taiwan. Alice, welcome to The Focus.
Hi.
Alice, can you give us an overview of the current political and economic climate in Taiwan?
Now, because we have a new President Lai, so basically everyone is looking forward to some new policy adjustments, but basically President Lai will be in line with President Tsai regarding China and regarding with relevant policy with the US.
So how has Taiwan's history shaped its current political status and its relations with mainland China?
So, John, you're asking the relationship between Taiwan and China in a historical perspective?
Yeah.
And so, well, basically, there are two very big different views, but culturally and historical wise, Taiwan is very closely aligned to China. Many people, their grandparents migrated from China just within 100 years, like my grandparents. And some they migrated a bit earlier, maybe like 200-300 years ago. So basically we share many similar things like the language, culture, but also because we are our history and culture develop in a very different context. For example, Taiwan was colonized by Japan for a while, and also because we are a small island compared to China. So there are many things that we actually progress in a very different way than China. And also, for example, we still use traditional Chinese. They use a simplified one. That is also very big difference. So most people in Taiwan now, although we agree that we are from the very same root, but we basically consider we are very different than Chinese people, and we are two different nations.
Do you think that, given what you've just said, there is an almost natural evolution of the two sides of China splitting apart and developing their own parallel destinies, in spite of the political overlay? Let's take the political overlay aside for a moment. But, Taiwan is an island. It's may not be geographically far removed like Australia is from the rest of the world, but it's certainly an island, and most islands kind of develop their own sense of themselves, especially if the close mainland power has no capacity to really influence it. And by influencing it, I mean by having its armed forces patrolling its streets.
Yes, so that's one thing that we are very geographically different. And also the way we deal with trade and international relations are also very different. And the main issue is Taiwan is suffering from our relationship with China, because legal term, de facto, we are already independent, but de jure they are different. Well, China will claim we are part of them, but we claim we were Republic of China, and now we are our own state. So and also because of that, we also have very different relationships with US or other countries in the world, for example. So basically, we are at a very different route. But having said that, we still see a lot of similarities with China. So I think there's still something that we cannot totally cut it into that. We are so different. We are different, but in some parts we still share the same culture context.
All right, this is going to be a tricky one, so bear with me while I try to unpack this. So, in your view, as someone who is living in Taiwan, do you feel like you're part of Chinese culture, or do you feel like Chinese culture is really an extension of mainland culture?
Um, I think depends on the which part you are referring to. For example, Chinese New Year, we totally, it's so important to us, like how Chinese people sing it. But there are also many culture stuff or holidays. Um, like the Moon Festival in which will be the upcoming. I think it's in September or October this year, and also the Dragon Ball Festival. Maybe you have heard. These are or something that we share. But on the other hand, there are also some other things that we don't have. We don't have in common, or we don't take it that seriously. And also, we have different national days. Ours is on October 10th, and they are also in October, but different days.
Can I ask you a question that maybe our audience would be quite interested to learn? I mean, initially, modern Taiwan was formed by the abandonment of the mainland by the Kuomintang that was fighting the communist forces of Mao Zedong. Now, with regard to that, the Kuomintang itself, as a political organization, doesn't seem to be that anti-China as it once was. Can you explain a little bit about the political evolution of the Kuomintang so our audience can kind of get a bit of a sense of the
Uh-huh.
lay of the land? Yeah.
I see. I see. Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think that's also something very complicated. So, of course, we started with Kuomintang and the Communist Party. They are obviously enemies. And what happened was Kuomintang they lost the war in mainland China, so they moved to Taiwan, and so. And then we also have different political parties. Like now, the president he's belonged to the DP party, and so if you look back in historical wise, they should be by they I mean the KMT Kuomintang. They should be very anti-communist, which they still are. But that's against the party. Um, Many of them, especially the older ones, like maybe like my even not even my dad's age, but even a bit older, they are still thinking of China, Taiwan to be united, still are one. But those people are actually gradually dying and disappearing because of the old age. But I think one thing very important for the KMT at this originally is China. They want to have like a united China. When I was a kid, there's still like we have to fight against the communists and take back China, those sort. But nowadays, especially young people, we kind of already accepted that because even my parents' age, they are born and grew up in Taiwan, so we don't really feel any connection to China. Um, like you can say that many Americans and Australians also migrate from England like 100 years ago, but you don't consider yourself as British.
No,
And so yeah,
some of
so
us
yeah.
do.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. Some people they
Yeah,
still think that they are British, and some they
yeah,
still think that they are Chinese. But
yeah.
most people they don't. They think we're Taiwanese. Yeah.
So, having said all of that, with regard to the way that people interact with each other in Taiwan,
Mm-hmm.
based on a political level. You know, you've got your KMT supporters, you've got other political supporters. Some are agnostic about unification with the mainland, some are dead against it, some are in favor of it. How is Taiwanese society from just an ordinary person walking down the street? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
is everyone a knife point, or is it much more calm? And I think that perhaps the West and Western media have amped up what we may be considering in terms of how we see Taiwan in our own mindsets. How does that work?
Uh-huh. Thank you, John. That's another very good question. Actually, in Taiwan, it's very peaceful. I think it's probably more peaceful than the US, my personal feelings. Yeah, so basically everybody in Taiwan lives in harmony. Although from TV, you see some of the legislators, member of the parliament, they fight the DPP, the green ones, or the KMT, the blue ones. As long as you are not the red ones, which yeah, represent CCP. Everybody is very peaceful, very calm, and basically do everything in a democratic way. But of course, when you are a politician, it also depends on the atmosphere. In Taiwan, it's more like hot. People likes to talk about it a bit, and the politician they also have to like act a little bit crazy for because they're showing they're fighting something. But in generally, if you are in Taiwan, it's very calm and peaceful.
So, I mean, if I were to walk the streets of Taipei and look into tea houses and cafes, I wouldn't be
Mm.
seeing, pro-China, anti-China people going hammer and tong in debate over what's going on. It's just something that they do privately, perhaps, but not overtly in public. Would that be considered bad manners if that were the case?
I think most people don't really talk about that if you hang out with your friends, and maybe they talked about it in family, but that usually only happens before major elections.
Right,
Mhm.
right.
And
Yep.
but many of my friends, we share different political views, but we can still talk in a very civilian way. So if you are ever in Taiwan, of course you can talk about it. And I think most people are they of course they also have they accept the idea of freedom of expression. Of course you can say you are pro-China, but that's not really a popular view. And I think the major difference is in Taiwanese media, you can rarely see that happening on in mainstream media, maybe some smaller ones, but the mainstream one, you will not really hear anybody really supportive of China. Even those KMT supporters, they also won't say that, and they also don't think that. They are just saying that maybe we should have a more calm and peaceful route by talking with China. But the DPP and some other ones, they are more pro. We should develop things more on military wise, and we need to prepare more to defend ourselves, those kind of things. That is the main point. But most of us, we are in general, we consider our Taiwanese, and we don't really hate China. It's not like that, but we just think that we are different than them.
Well, obviously, things would change quite
Mm-hmm.
significantly were China to, enforce a naval blockade on Taiwan and threaten it in a very existential manner. In such a situation, and mind you, it's only hypothetical at this point, but let's talk about it because the Western commentariat are
Mm.
completely what's the word? Um, they have a. I was I interviewed Dr. Andrew Michter a couple of nights back, and he said something about Trump derangement syndrome. I think that in the Western media and the commentariat, we have Taiwan derangement syndrome in many ways.
Mm.
But if it were to really come to blows, how secure are you, as someone who lives in Taiwan, that the nation will hold together? Or do you think that there is the likelihood of a catastrophic splitting up of the various camps, the political camps, one in favor of, unification by force, another one sitting on the fence, and the other one fighting it or resisting it? Is national cohesion a problem if the unfortunate aspect were to come to pass and we see military related threats issued in a way that could be a precursor to an invasion, for instance?
Yeah, that's also another common questions that we get, especially a lot of delegations from the West.
Yep.
And I think it's at this for now, it's not that really an issue. And if the concern is about cohesion of the people, I also don't really think that's an issue. I would say most people in Taiwan don't want unification, but they would want to have a peaceful solution. I think there's less than 5 or even 3% of people that they would want to really unite with China. But if you are talking from the point of view of how to deal with Taiwan and China matters, if the situation happens, and some would say that, well, maybe there's the Hong Kong model, but the Hong Kong model now proves to be very, it's not really welcome, because you feel that actually China is controlling more than initially they are promised. And so most Taiwanese people, of course, we still want to keep our independence, but we want to have a peaceful way. So it's not really about we want to have fight till the end or reunite with them. That's not really the things that people are concerned. People are more concerned about how can we try to avoid the war, and if some conflict happens, how can we find a peaceful solution?
I hate to ask you this, but I have to. Since 2021, since the foundation of AUKUS, there's been almost like a fever pitch development in terms of the West's perception of China in the broader Indo-Pacific. We see it as an existential threat. We look at, agents of the CCP in our respective countries doing all sorts of things to kind of destabilize and keep our countries from being stable, right? But then we also look at the Taiwan Strait as the critical issue. How much pressure does Taiwan feel it's being put under by the West because of the West's idea of China as an existential threat to the international order?
Thank you, John. That's all. Yeah, that would be something I would like to mention. Of course, we also feel the threat from China, but that only happens. It's not really affecting us. And of course, it might affect the government and especially Ministry of Defense. But for now, it's just some minor threat. I wouldn't say it's anything that of real concern. But we do feel a lot of pressure, especially from the U.S. The U.S., I think publicly and also in those more governmental private channel, confidential channel, they did a lot of pressuring. I personally also feel that from my workload, I got a lot of delegation from visiting us and would like to exchange ideas about China issue. And most of them are from US. Recently, we also have some from Canada and of course from Europe and other places, but mostly from US. So now we are also very focusing on the US election. If Trump will be there, he already mentioned that we didn't, Taiwan did not do enough, didn't pay enough, those kind of comments. So yeah, it will also the pressure if it might increase will really be up to President Trump or President Harris.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to ask you, how are Taiwanese policymakers actually looking at events in the United States at the moment? And you've just answered that one quite well. And I will say that there are other aspects to the Taiwan-US relationship, which I think are really interesting. Like, for instance, Taiwan's significance to the global economy is based on supply chains, especially at the high-tech chip manufacturing. But of course, the United States is starting to develop its own plants, which will be possibly eventually in direct competition with those of Taiwan. But the strategic aspect is that once the US chip plants start moving upwards, then the question has to be, how important will Taiwan be for the United States? How important will Taiwan be for the United States under those circumstances, do you think?
Yes, that's another tricky thing because a lot of people, when they mentioned importance of Taiwan, is because of the chips especially TSMC and some tech company. So
Yeah.
that is really something very important. But I would say that's not just all. Even like strategical wise, geopolitical wise, Taiwan is very important to US because it's on the first island chain.
Mm.
And so yeah, but we are a bit concerned that when US they also gain the technology, then maybe they will care even less about Taiwan should event of a crisis happen.
All right. So, with regard to the relationship between Taiwan and China, in the West, we have this view that they're two very distinct entities marching to their own beats. But
Mm-hmm.
the reality is much more complicated. Taiwan has invested very heavily in
Mm-hmm.
China financially. Arguably, it's one of the key members that has lifted the mainland China out of its doldrums economically and has kickstarted its uh, moving into advanced manufacture, right? As has the Japanese, for instance. And yet, when we look at China, we tend to divorce China from Taiwan. We tend to divorce China from Japan. And we certainly don't talk about the foreign direct investment from both Taiwan and Japan that has entered in the billions, if not now hundreds of billions of dollars since China's opening to the world in 1978. So when it comes to the politics of the situation, the reality is Taiwan and Japan, in many ways, have a economic stranglehold on China. How does this work in an age now where there's been so much international pressure placed among Western countries on themselves to decouple from China, and how is this affecting Taipei?
On this point, I think actually Chinese people are very realistic here. Our government tried to shift our economical and trade not so heavily dependent on China, but in reality, it is quite difficult. We do heavily rely on them, same as many European countries. Like for example, many European countries they said they will be more supportive of Taiwan, and they will also boycott China, or if event like the Ukraine-Russia war happened, they will also sanction China. But they also said they still want to keep very good economical relationship with China. So it's very hard for them to actually decouple these things. So I think Chinese people are quite realistic on this. We try to shift like more on Southeast Asia, for example, try to develop, but it's not, it's helping, but not that much. Still, most of our economic and trade, we are still relying on China. That is something I don't think we can really get around it. Yeah.
Is that because of the way the Chinese do business? You know, the top-down driven model is a much more effective model in terms of being able to see how your monies are being expended in a good way. Whereas in Southeast Asia, things are a little bit murkier. They're a
Mm.
little bit difficult. They're slower. They're not as effective or maybe, dare I say, efficient as, their Chinese contemporaries in many ways. So does it make Southeast Asia, as you rightly point out, not so safe bet for Taiwan to divest itself from
Mhm.
China?
And yeah, I would say one of the reason is what you just mentioned, and second, the most important thing is quantity, because mainland China is so big, you can
Yeah.
easily sell. You can just earn more. And another thing is, I think many Southeast Asian countries, they are also not that politically stable. Some of them will be high risk countries. And another thing is this cultural bond, as we mentioned in the very beginning, because Taiwan and China, we are different, but we still share a lot of same cultural issues, and can read the air easily. Like if you say something, but maybe I know what's really in your mind, but it doesn't work like that with Southeast Asian countries. With the West, maybe it's slightly easier because maybe people are more fighting with those trade and customs, but with Southeast Asia, it's a different issue. So government is trying to expand different possibilities, but still we are still very relying on China.
Is there any knowledge within Taipei or even care among senior politicians and policymakers about what goes on within China? And here I'm referring to China's ongoing persecution of Uyghur minorities, the Tibetans, Hong Kongers, and various other minorities that, are potentially religiously inclined. Is there any care and attention being placed on these disaffected groups within China by people in Taiwan? Or is it just a matter of, well, China is big enough, they can look after themselves and we don't want to get involved? What's the prevailing attitude?
I would say, of course, people are caring about them, but I would say that many Chinese people they actually care more about themselves. Of course, if you are asking about scholars or policymakers, it is part of their concern, but I would say they are more focused on regarding Chinese policies and domestic issues like Xi Jinping's movement and also their economy. With regard to the minority, there are, but actually not that much. Still more focused on political and economical matters.
What's the average Taiwanese view of China's military modernization and expansion plans? On a sister podcast a few years ago, we spoke with well, I mean, he was the commander of US forces in Japan, and he was
Mm.
mentioning how China was increasingly using its military muscle to intimidate Japan and Taiwan. And he cited the number of aircraft that were flying close to exclusive air zones or ships that were sort of moving close to, the exclusive economic zones of both Taiwan and Japan. Um, this is one of the reasons why we built this threat in our own Western mindset. But in Taiwan, you're open to the Western media. You know what we think about things. Do you think the same? Do you worry about the Chinese military in any substantial fashion?
Speaking of Japan, because I was just in Japan 2 weeks ago, this is also something they have been wanting to exchange ideas with us. And I would say that because Japan, they themselves, they also made it before, they don't really care that much about Taiwan. They're more or China. Their main focus, their main enemy is North Korea. And with China, they kind of, it's like quite peaceful. But recently, they also feel the threat from China, especially as you mentioned about like the ADIZ or the issues on South China Seas. They feel more pressure. That's why they also want to build more relationship and also possible military or non-military cooperation with Taiwan. And as to Taiwan, because we have been suffering from threat from China all the time, like since I was born, or even when my parents they were born, it's becoming something that is just like daily life. So I think it's a bit different for the West and or Japan because they are from we are like peace, we are partners, and then suddenly shift to this might be our possible enemies or threat. But for Chinese people, I would say that we actually feel that before we feel we are like alone, like a lonely island on the world. But now because now we let people to see that it's not just Taiwan on the threat by China, other nations too. So I would say this is actually maybe a way out for Taiwan because now other countries will try to really establish real cooperation, more possibilities of communication with us.
So when the Russian tanks poured over the border, there was a sense that Russia was trying to rectify a historic wrong because Ukraine did have some Russian-speaking areas that they thought really ought to belong to Mother Russia. What lessons, if any, do you think Taiwan has learned from the Ukraine war in terms of sitting next to a much larger neighbor that is militarily capable?
Mm.
Are you concerned or about the kind of support you may or may not receive from your allies, namely the United States, Japan, Australia, us guys in the Indo-Pacific region?
Thank you, John. That really was another excellent point I would also like to mention. Yes, I think before Ukraine, Russia, everybody still thinks that, well, China is threatening us, but it's not really a real issue because people are rational. But having seen what Putin has done, it makes the risk maybe from 20 and already increased to 60 or even 70 that the political leaders, even maybe in the beginning they were rational ones, but something will change, so it makes the likelihood much higher. And yeah, so that's one point, that we cannot really think that, okay, we are peaceful for so long, so nothing bad will happen. This mindset we have changed. And another thing is, Taiwan is definitely not Ukraine in many ways. For example, we're an island, so using tanks would not be very possible. But if you mention, as you have mentioned, like a blockade or quarantine, that will be very deadly to us. And also, we really consider that it is not. We should not rely on our allies, although we really need international support. But U.S., even the situation with Ukraine and Russia, they provided some support, but not much. So we know that we will have to be on our own, and trying to make more progress on ourselves, because when the event happens, we don't really think that US will come at the right moment. Like, we think they will come, but maybe at a very later stage. So we have to wait till then.
I saw a recent 60 Minutes mini doco on Taiwan, and it was very much a flag waving, pro-US, anti-China piece. And basically, they were showing that Taiwanese society was so virulently anti-China and so virulently pro-America. It gave one the impression that Taiwan was prepared to arm its civilian population under all manner of deadly scenarios. What can you tell us outside of Taiwan what the reality of the situation is like? Because I think a lot of people watching these sort of, I hate to say it, propaganda pieces, there you go, I've said it, tend to get carried away with them. And by getting carried away, we tend to lose sight of what China actually is to us collectively. Um, a while back, Sage International, my company, we wrote a report on the Indo-Pacific and the strategic dynamics. And one of the conclusions was that China is a threat, but it's not the sort of threat we're looking for. It's like that old Star Wars things. These are the droids, but they're not the droids you're looking for. China has intelligence assets embedded within our societies. They're obviously using influence operations to buy as much influence as possible. They're using cyber. They're using a lot of non-kinetic, very sneaky, very tricky ways of being able to wrong foot us. But we keep on focusing on the hard power element. And I think to our detriment, because the likelihood of a war breaking out would be catastrophic. And I mean, one of the reasons why it would be catastrophic is because the first thing that would happen is that American naval air power will strike out at Chinese cities, and the Three Gorges Dam, which is that huge, well, it's the world's largest dam, then becomes a legitimate target in the eyes of American military people conducting the war. And that in itself would be the equivalent of actually lobbing a nuclear weapon, because if you break the Three Gorges Dam, the level of flooding, I think the flooding would probably wipe out about three major cities and cost anywhere up to about 80 million people in casualties. So it would be rather foolish for the Chinese to overtly do anything that would, get as a result this major push against it, because it would damage China fundamentally and probably break the back of the CCP. Um, so in terms of all of this sort of pro-US, anti-China setup, we thought that the intelligence threat that China posed was the more fundamental threat. rather than the military threat. Because again, if you look at the force structure of the Chinese military, yes, it's big, but big things don't necessarily mean good things. Just look at the Russian military, for instance. So the Russian military is good with the meat waves, but it's not so good with the technology. And that we're seeing in real time as we speak. I suspect that with China, it will be very similar because the Chinese military playbook comes out of the old Soviet playbook with Chinese characteristics. So it can't be that far removed from what we're currently seeing on the battlegrounds of Ukraine right now. So again, I tend to be a little bit more upbeat in terms of our hard power kinetic security, but I'm not so confident about the real threat to us, which is the non-kinetic aspects of the Chinese state reaching in and making things happen, which would be against our interests. Yeah.
Yes, John, I totally agree with you on this point. It is also my opinion that I think real this hard conventional war, I don't really think it will happen. But what is more concerning and more worrying is exactly the things you have said regarding intelligence or disinformation. And also one thing that really worries us is the lawfare technique they are using.
Yeah.
They have
Yeah.
imposing because although my background is international law, but international law is not that easy to apply. But if you are using your domestic law, you are using your own law enforcement, that is so much easier. And then maybe you will have a legal lawsuit with other countries, but then it will take time. So what China is doing now is very worrying. They have the Coast Guard, and then they have new laws. Then the ones they just passed, they even said that it's really worrying us because like maybe like now we're having the conversation that they might consider anti-China. They might use their own law enforcement power to maybe they will just take you to trial, and it's really hard to know what they would do. So, for example, I used to fly Cathay Pacific because when I was studying in London, that's like the fastest route I transfer in Hong Kong. But now, although my company forbid us to fly through China or Hong Kong, even just transfer. Now I'm also slightly worried, even if I not in my in the military Ministry of Defense affiliated institution, I also might not want to take those airlines because once I'm in their jurisdiction, it's really hard to say what will happen. And I'm mostly, I don't have any security clearance and those stuff. So it is something really worrying and terrifying to many Chinese people, especially people in the government and military.
How successful has Taiwan been in maintaining and expanding its international relationship despite diplomatic pressure from China?
You mean our diplomatic relationships with other countries?
Yes.
Um, yeah, that's also another thing that we don't just do it like one track. We try to do it expand many possibilities, many options as possible, like economical wise or education wise. Like the government, they provided a lot of scholarship fundings to Western students or basically foreign students, not just the West, because we want to we want to have more international support as possible. And another thing we're trying to use now is think tanks, like my company. We try to establish relationships with our with many countries, and not because going through public governmental channels sometimes is not that easy. But if we can go through this, we call it 1.5 or 2 tracks, then we maybe can have something being done or discuss a lot of things that less sensitively. So our government is trying to use as many ways as possible. But I would say the major thing is they really try to keep up their relationship with the US. And so also, as we have previously mentioned, who will be the next president of US matters a lot to our government.
So, what are the recent diplomatic victories and setbacks that Taiwan has experienced? Because I think that that's a natural follow-up to what we've just been discussing.
I would say is that we don't have many officials, officially international partners. That is, we are losing, how to say that, international diplomatic recognition. They
Yep.
decided to build formal relationship with China instead of Taiwan. And also in most countries, we cannot call ourselves embassy. We have to use representative office. So there are many ways that China can actually pressure us. And it depends on if they really want to do it or not. Because in some ways, if they really want to make our lives difficult in international community, they can. So it's a matter really hard to deal with.
Yeah, I mean the recent experience of losing recognition by the Solomon Islands, I think, is a key example of this, right? So, but that has a lot to do with local forces on the ground. I mean, if they see that they're going to get a better deal from the People's Republic, they're going to go with the People's
Yeah.
Republic. They're not going to stick with Taiwan. Is that a case of because China carries much more money in its bag as opposed to Taiwan? I mean, is it that crude?
In some extent, I would say yes, because they are, of course, in much bigger countries. They have more money in their bags. They have more bags, I would say. So,
Yeah.
and also, yeah, of those countries, some of them they don't really have really good records. So it is also a bit risky for us to keep funding them. But even without those ones, we would like to have more international support as possible. But sometimes even those little stuff can be, if China wants to interfere with it, they can do it. Let me give you an example. Just quite recently, after the new president, the President Lai inauguration, Austria in Europe, they said that Taiwanese people cannot use our international driving license in Austria anymore because they don't
Wow.
really recognize us. But they did this without any warning. Usually they will issue a warning or give you like alternative solution. For example, in Japan, we also cannot use our international driving license. But what they did is we can apply for a Japanese translation of our own driving license, and you can still use that to rent a car in Japan. But Austria, they just decided to revoke it without any warning. And of course, they didn't say it's China pressuring them, but because of the timing, and yeah, I think that's like something that is really hard for us to avoid.
Now, being half Austrian, I've got to say I'm a little bit upset by that.
Really?
Oh, well, anyway,
Yeah.
it is, as they say. So, Alice, looking forward, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities for Taiwan?
I would say that because now we have a new president, so we are very looking forward. We are looking forward that he will have more policies and still continue the formal president wrote, but he will add something different to it. And another thing is, it's better to have changes than just to stay in like where you were. So with the international community and the world is also globally is very dynamically moving. And I would say that it's actually not that bad for Taiwan because we do have many more possibilities.
So, how do you see the situation evolving over the next few years for Taiwan? I mean, Western analysts have predicted that a war for the reunification of Taiwan will come sooner rather than later, some even suggesting 2025 or 2027. Why these dates? What's the significance? Some commentators have suggested that 2027 has become a fixation within the Washington Beltway.
Well, I think it's more about China than Taiwan. There are so many different days. I don't know, what date is real anymore. It depends on what China wants because China they will also have their own election and they will also because they have their own internal issues. They will need to do something to strengthen their own internal support. That is something very important for them. So I think most of the analysts, they look at it from the Chinese perspective. But I would say, I think maybe in the next 10 years, at least I would say it won't happen because China has so many other real issues they need to deal with. But that I'm referring to really hard power or military wise. They will not give up to using those softer ones, as we have mentioned, like intelligence gathering, disinformation, coast guards, lawfare. These they will continue to be doing.
Based on your research and expertise, Alice, what would you say is the most common misconception about Taiwan?
I think that Taiwan is really not that in a dangerous state as the Western sees it. I often feel that my Western friends or Western analysts are more concerned about Taiwan. I mean, of course, having people come care for us is a good thing, but I think sometimes they picture us from a more only like from a single angle, a single perspective. As you have mentioned in the very beginning, actually in Taiwan, we quite live in harmony, peaceful. People care more of those first world problem stuff instead of these war or conflict issues. So I think that about Taiwan is that we're actually quite safe and there are peaceful solutions to this issue, but most Western commentators they've really focused a lot on this unavoidable war that might happen. So they will have these numbers like what year and the numbers of our reserves. You know, how's your military training? How's people if they will be like Ukraine, will fight to the death. Of course, Chinese people love our own country, but we will want to have more, we will prefer to solve the issues in a peaceful way.
Do you think that Taiwan suffers from not having enough sovereignty, not just from China, but from the rest of the world, to try to figure out a path forward without having to look forward to a war or some other military calamity?
I don't really think sovereignty is the issue. Actually, we do own our sovereignty, you know, like territorial and other things. But I do think what we are really in need, what we really lack is information sharing with our partners. Like, for example, Australia has Five Eyes, US, yeah, with US, United Kingdom and other countries. But Japan, they also have different channels with the West. And there's also G7 or G8. There are many different channels for other countries, but for Taiwan, we really don't have that. So when we are making some judgments or analysis, we sometimes suffering where we just don't have enough information and nobody is really sharing these things with us. So that is something I think we really need. And that would be great if our international allies or partners can support us in this regard.
So basically, if we were to set a sort of intelligence architecture that could be compatible with the Five Eyes, as well as for the needs and requirements of, say, the Taiwanese, the Japanese, the South Koreans, you know, and focus on the threat that we were discussing before, the intelligence level threat that China poses, perhaps that in itself would be a major victory for the West without having to expend tens of billions of dollars developing a military counterbalance to the Chinese.
Yes, exactly. That would be something very useful and what Chinese government really need.
Dr. Alice Yang, thanks for joining us and for sharing your insights on the focus.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. From Taiwan, that was Assistant Research Fellow at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research, Dr. Alice Yang. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Alice Yang. To learn more about Alice and connect with her on social media, check out the links in our show notes. If you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Have comments or questions about the podcast? Drop them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to answer as many of them as I can. Stay connected with us on social media. Follow me at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at @thefocus_sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.